Welcome to the Gender in Focus podcast. I'm Elle, and each week I get to ask Kai Scott, the president of Transfocus Consulting, all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about trans and non-binary people in the workplace and in the wider world.
Unfortunately, if we just have kind of two genders, we miss all of this richness that exists.
For a lot of people, there's a lot of pain associated that in coming to terms with that. Is it that they're seeking attention, or is it that they're seeking connection?
Welcome back to Gender in Focus and happy International Non-Binary Peoples Day. July 14th is a day to pause, celebrate, and spotlight the richness and resilience of non-binary identities. And today's episode is extra special. Usually it's Elle asking the questions, but not this time. The mic is flipped and Elle is in the hot seat. In honor of the day, I'm going to take the interviewer role and dive into Elle's story and perspectives on as a non-binary person. And I'm really excited and, of course, super honored that Elle agreed to do this because, of course, we're not wanting to put this on anybody that doesn't want to. But I'm so glad you're here. Hello, Elle. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. Had a great weekend. And so, yeah, just really excited to talk about this topic. Typically, when we're talking about trans and non binary issues, the focus tends to be on trans women and trans men, and non binary folks are often overlooked, which I think we need to adjust. And so that's why this type of day is so important. But I'd love to hear from you. What is International Non Binary Peoples Day?
Well, first of all, it is obviously a day all about me, so I fully expect everyone to have their attention on me. No, it's a day to celebrate non-binary people. I think you're right that maybe the conversation around trans issues is focused primarily on trans men and trans women, so it's just a day to recognize and celebrate non-binary people. It's directly between International Women's Day in March and International Men's Day in November. So it's right in the middle of that, which feels cute to me. And it's all about celebrating non-binary people.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I echo that. It's really important to know that. And can you dive a little bit more into why it's important to celebrate non-binary people separately from, say, the broader 2S LGBTQIA community? I know there's numerous awareness days, and of course, each one is important in their own respect. But why focus on non-binary folks?
I think really, I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding around non-binary issues and non-binary people in general, but also
Mm,
within the 2S LGBTQIA community. So I
right.
think it's really important to have that because again, like we do lump these issues in with more generic trans issues, and while there is a lot of overlap, they aren't the
Mm,
same. So
mm,
it is important to kind of highlight. I would say every identity deserves to be recognized individually, but for non-binary people, I think it can be overlooked. And yeah, just the fact that there is so much misunderstanding in the wider community, but also within our community as well. That's why it's important to me. I like seeing that, at least, is because it can kind of offer another perspective or other kind of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And just an opportunity for a deeper dive. Because sometimes when
Mhm.
you have kind of 2S LGBTQIA, that's just so many different identities. And
Yeah.
it's like an overview, but you can't really dive into. And that's what I'm
Mhm.
so excited about here today to dive into those. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about you and your identity and really just appreciating that you're one of so many non
Mhm.
binary folks. So just that this is your story is an important aspect of it. But I think it helps illustrate some of the things that perhaps people just have not had an opportunity to hear about, to think about. And so I'd love to hear more about you and your identity.
When it comes to non-binary as a label, I think it's maybe not understood that it's an umbrella term and that there are
Mm,
so many identities within a non-binary identity. So you could have like genderqueer, gender fluid, demigirl, demiboy, bigender, pangender. Like there's so many. I think I've
mm,
missed loads, but there are so many. For me, I identify closely or more closely with gender fluidity.
mm,
So I feel like I'm both a woman and non-binary, and that shifts for me quite a lot. It
Mm,
fluctuates maybe on a day-to-day basis, but also within the day. I might feel differently about my gender. And sometimes even depending on the situation I'm in, it might
mm,
change. And then sometimes I'll feel both at the same time. That doesn't happen so often for me, but it has happened, and I
mm,
know a few people for whom that's the norm. But for me, it tends to be separated. I think that can be a little hard, maybe, to understand
mm,
for a lot of people for whom they just have their one gender. But for me, it fluctuates quite a lot,
mm.
and it was very hard to pinpoint because I couldn't work out what that was and why I would
Yeah.
feel so different. It's a really confusing thing, especially because we don't have like a blueprint exactly for what that looks like.
No kidding. I can only imagine just how much it is to unpack gender in general. And then if there's, that variability that you're describing, then you're like, oh, maybe I'm not that, but then you
Yeah.
are that, but it's just momentarily not there. Right. So
Hmm.
it's just like, how can you stay in that, and honor it as well?
Hmm.
And without a blueprint, that's so true. There's just no way in our society that we've set up, where there's an understanding, for
Hmm.
somebody to explore that and to come to that understanding.
I didn't really think about it too much
Mm,
prior to about 2 years ago. But on reflection, when I look back and see myself as a little kid, how
mm,
confusing I found it. And like I can pinpoint these moments, especially in my teens, of where I was getting really muddled
mm.
and I didn't didn't know what was going on, and I was getting really confused. And it's interesting to reflect back on that. But now I have language for it, so I didn't have
Right.
language for it then.
Yeah, the having language for it, for something that's genuinely, authentically happening internally is paramount.
Hmm.
And if that's not available as a kid, it is totally and completely. I can only imagine how disorienting, the ways
Yeah.
that you describe, and just like, holy smokes. And when I hear your description, what comes to mind is, I mean, I'm sure this is something that you've cultivated over time, but is a matter of presence with self.
Hmm.
And I just was kind of interested if you would like to share, how did you come to that presence with self? Because you're really able to observe kind of what's coming up and in the moment, and that coming and going.
I mean, therapy is a big answer to
Hey.
that. But no, I would say more generally learning to trust myself was
Mm,
how I then began to pinpoint it. And so I was having a bit of a hard time a few years ago, just nothing to do with my gender, and
mm,
having to go through gradually learning to trust myself about who I am through that also just opened these doors to understanding other parts of myself that I hadn't really looked at. It was just understanding that there are so many different parts that make up the whole,
yep.
and kind of leaning into each individual part and looking at it, just
Mm,
allowing myself to really look at it and not have to do anything about it, but just see it. It was a really important part of that.
mm.
And the way that I have described it, it's a bit cringe, so forgive me, but this is the way I can
No
describe it.
such thing. No such thing. All of
That's
it's
not
so
true.
important.
This way of understanding it was, so you know how we had a conversation a while ago on the podcast about being outside and how important
Mm,
going outside is.
mhm,
That's all true, and I love being outside. But then there's this other part of me that really likes, I'm such a homebody, and I
mhm,
love getting my cute candles and shutting my curtains and making my home cozy and cute. And it's very warm and comforting and familiar and cozy, and I
mhm,
love that so much. And that to me feels like this aspect of my womanhood, and
mm,
that it's familiar and it's exactly where I want to be when I want to be there. And that's true. I really love that. And at the same time, I also love being outside, and I
mm,
love being out in nature, and I love like where being at home feels very enveloping and safe. Being outside feels very expansive and huge and
mm,
spacious and exciting. And I love both of those things. And both
mm,
of those things are almost like they're seemingly opposed, but
mm,
they work together to create like a whole life that I love. And that's how this feels to me. Being non
mm,
binary feels like I have this part of me that I love, but there's all this other stuff too. And realizing that I'm made up of different parts that might seem to conflict, but actually just make up a whole human. That's how I came to terms with this. Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And that's like deeply profound and just also, yeah, like being with oneself in a way that is complete, right? Rather than
Mm.
kind of shutting down aspects of oneself because it
Mhm.
doesn't fit into this mold that we've been provided by society, which sure for some people works great, but if it
Mhm.
doesn't for some of us, including yourself, then what is a model that works for you? I mean, model sounds a bit like esoteric, but just
No.
a way of being that incorporates all those different aspects. And what a beautiful analogy too, right? Because I think people can relate to wanting to be cozy and adventurous, right? And why would
Mhm.
you exclude one or even both because it doesn't fit somehow? It's just like, no,
Yeah.
you could do both.
Yeah, it's so freeing. And yeah, I mean, if I had to stay locked in my house, I love being home, but if I had to be home and locked in, I would feel
Mm,
very suffocated.
mm,
And if I only lived in a tent and I never had somewhere else to go, I imagine I'd be pretty uncomfortable. So it's sort of this
true.
really nice balance. And
Mm,
I love both. I wouldn't want to let go of either of those things. And
mhm,
for some people, that isn't what it feels like. Their gender as a man or a woman feels like all of that as well, but for
mm,
me they feel separate, like these two
right.
separate things. Yeah, and I know that's not everybody's experience, but it is mine.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic, and that you're committed to figuring that out, even though I'm sure was a lot of you know difficulty or pain
Hmm.
associated it just like no, just you know staying the course and
Yeah.
coming to these very powerful realizations. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really insightful and really gives people a texture of this because unfortunately if we just have kind of two genders, we miss all of this richness that exists. It's exciting when people are committed to themselves and also like you sharing that so that people have that insight into people's gender. And just last week, we had a question from an audience member about what does gender fluid mean, and is it different from agender, right? So
Mm.
sometimes we have all these terms, and I appreciate that if people aren't exposed to them or haven't learned about them yet, kind of maybe a bit disorienting for them.
Hmm.
So
For sure.
yeah, and so I'm glad you've given like a richer insight into your experience of gender fluidity.
We kind of often think of it as like of when we have a Venn diagram of like this circle is woman and this circle is man, and there are a few people that are in the middle. I think that's how people think of non-binary people.
Mm,
For me, I feel more like on the outside bit of the Venn diagram. I don't
mm,
think of myself as in the middle, and I think that's where we get a bit lost when it comes to like gender expression. Is
mm,
that we put non-binary people in the middle of being a woman and being a man, and to
mm,
me, it's just about expansion rather
mm.
than another little box to put myself in. Like
Right.
I think often we just love boxes. Humans love boxes, or at least in the
For
West, we love
sure.
boxes. Being non-binary for me feels like taking the lid off the box rather than putting myself in a separate
Mm,
box.
gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is then you can be with whatever is coming up rather than
Hmm.
having to like figure out okay which box does this now belong into, and it sounds like you can just be.
Hmm. That's what it feels closest to,
Uh,
where being in my little cute house feels like comfort, and being out
mm,
in the forest, in that analogy, feels doesn't feel as comfortable. And maybe that's because I'm quite newly out, but it
mm,
does feel the most natural.
mm,
Like I feel the closest to myself in that scenario.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Wow. And you just touched on something that I think is really important about gender expression, right? The
Mm.
difference between kind of gender identity, our internal felt sense of our gender versus gender expression, kind of the outward appearance of folks. And
Hmm.
I kind of one of my next set of questions is just about common misunderstandings or myths, and one of them is about gender expression. And so, yeah, that and perhaps some other ones that you can think of that aren't related to that. You just can you explain some of the common myths and misunderstanding of non-binary folks?
Yeah, I mean, gender expression is the one that I probably struggle with the most. Is
Mm,
that and not just from other people, but it's one that I struggle with within myself too, or I
Mm,
really grappled with it, which is that to be non-binary is to be androgynous, and to be androgynous is to
mm,
be non-binary, and those two things are actually totally separate thing. They don't mean anything together at all. And there
mm.
are a lot of non-binary people who are androgynous. There's also a lot of androgynous people who are not non-binary,
Yeah.
and who express themselves in that way. So I present in a way that we really associate with femininity, and
Hmm.
it it's hard because it often means that people don't believe me,
Hmm.
or there's a lot of doubt around my identity, because
Yeah.
why, like I've had why have you got long hair then, or why do you like pink, or why it just, these things are so shallow. The way that we focus on gender in the West especially is
Mm,
just these shallow things that aren't real. Like it's all made up. There's no gene that says men like blue and women like pink. There's no,
right.
like that doesn't mean anything. We've just decided that that's what it is. And
Right.
so the same would apply for non-binary people. There is no rule about
Mm,
what it looks like to be non-binary. And so I feel like I align with a very feminine expression, but that doesn't mean that I'm not non-binary.
that they're two separate concepts, and that people, their identity is really just that internal experience.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
then what people choose to do on the exterior is, completely up to them, based on a whole variety of things that are about authenticity.
You said something once that was really beautiful, and you said it like months ago, and I think about it really regularly,
Mm,
which was that you said, and I'm not going to remember it word for word, but you said something about how your femininity is a part of what makes you a man.
mm,
And I loved that so much, because that is it. That's
mhm,
exactly it. That these are ways that we express ourselves, but it doesn't take away anything from our identity, and that your
mhm,
masculinity or your manhood is not questioned by the fact
mm,
that you have a flowery shirt on
mm.
in some context. Like
Right.
do you know what I mean? Like it's, you're not at risk. Your gender isn't at risk if you like things that maybe would surprise people. And
Right.
I think it's really sad that we assign these things to certain people
Mm,
and say that you can't like a flowery shirt if you're a man, or you can't like pink if you're a man, and you can't like blue if you're a girl, or, or if you're a woman, or
mhm.
it's just so silly. And there's so many things, like I love playing with gender quite a lot, and
Yeah.
when I'm referring to myself, I use gendered language all the time, just because I find it's like an in joke for me,
Right.
where I'll refer to myself as a girl or a girly, even though I'm
Uh-huh.
non-binary, because I'm doing something that's very, very feminine. I'm sort of leaning into it to be silly to myself.
Mm,
But then there'll be other things, like uh, I love car engines. I mess around with car engines quite a lot. I used to when I had a car. And
yeah.
that one, the reaction I get when I say that I like things is like I've just said, like I've murdered a family or something.
Right.
Like the reaction's so big. And it's like,
Yeah.
I just have long hair and I like car engines. There's nothing actually inherently wrong about that.
Uh,
And so the way that we like obsess with these boxes is so
mm.
restrictive. And I love messing around with it and not being a part of that, um, but also being a part of it. Does that
For
make sense?
sure. Yeah, 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 of course. I mean, there are things that are genuine that, society expects. And then there are other parts that, are just of your interest.
Hmm.
And I love that example of the car engine, right? Because, people don't expect that, and then, overreact or have a lot of questions. There's a number of different ways that people signal that this is not, quote, the norm, or what
Hmm.
usually should happen. You just like car engines, and,
Yeah, it's fun.
figuring them out. Like,
Yeah.
and we do this so often. I don't think people maybe are conscious of just how often it happens. And
Hmm.
of course, a lot to non-binary folks, especially in the ways that you described around gender expression. But to really many other folks, I mean, once we start doing education sessions, all these stories come out, and I'm like, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, so tragic that we're
Hmm.
gonna block off certain things because that's not what our gender tells us, or the society tells our gender should do
Hmm.
or want to do or whatnot. So, yeah,
For sure. I think
yeah,
I just think being non-binary doesn't mean I have to give up the things I really like to do,
Hmm.
or the way I like to dress, or the way I like to express myself. I just those two things are separate, and you can be non-binary and androgynous if you want, or you can be
Hmm.
non-binary and super masculine if you want, or in my way is to be very feminine and still non-binary. That doesn't make me less non-binary because of it, in the same way that if you are a man who likes pink, you're not less of a man. And I think the reason I love non-binary people, it's not
Hmm.
just because we're great, but because there's so much tenacity in that.
Hmm.
But you just have to be yourself. I think this is true of all trans people in general, to be honest with you.
Right.
The way that we have these restrictions means to acknowledge that you're trans or non-binary is inherently to be tenacious, I
Hmm.
think.
Hmm.
And I just wish that we could all do that. It's not restricted to it because
Hmm.
everybody does something that's outside of what we think the norm is. Everyone
Right.
has something.
Yeah. True. True. But you're right. In the face of so many messages from society, y-
Hmm.
it, to be able to keep going does require a lot of tenacity.
Hmm.
And, there's some playfulness too, which you've described. But yeah, to stay committed to who one is, it's just, yeah, it takes a
Hmm.
lot. And
It
sometimes
does.
it's easier, sometimes harder, it varies. But so I was wondering if there are any other
Hmm.
common myths and misconceptions about non-binary folks.
I think another one that I've experienced and struggle with is the idea that it's made up and
Hmm.
that it's all just like attention seeking. I
Hmm.
think I read so many comments like that online, especially. I mean, there are sort of two things I want to say about that. That first of all, that we need to really understand that humans are social beings and that
Right.
we need each other. The need to feel seen is it's about survival. The need to be seen and understood by each other, to connect with each other, is like our survival depends on it. And
Hmm.
if someone
Yeah.
shares with you that they're non-binary, it takes so much reflection to get to that point. It's not just a random, I've woken up this morning and decided I'm non-binary. It takes so much. It's taken me years and years and years to
Mm.
really come to terms with this. And for a lot of people, there's a lot of pain associated that in coming to terms with that. Is it that they're seeking attention, or is it that they're seeking connection when somebody
Mm.
shares this with you?
Yeah.
I don't know. Whenever I've told someone about being non-binary, and there haven't been many, it's always been people that I want to connect with and that I
Mm.
want them to understand who I am.
Yeah.
And if I didn't tell them, nothing would happen. I'm somebody that is fine with being seen as a woman, so it doesn't
Right.
actually matter. But you are not, then there's this huge part of me that you don't know, and so you
Mm.
can only get so far with knowing
Right.
me. So up until really December 2024, no one really knew me.
Mm.
Not really, they knew me well enough, but there was this thing, quite a big thing, or quite a big part of who I am that they didn't know. So I don't think that it's attention seeking to want to be recognized as real. The second thing, though, is that even if it's true that people are attention seeking, is that bad? Like,
Mm.
is there? I don't know. Often for trans and non-binary people, they've been hiding this thing for so long
Mm.
that, and it's so significant, and it's like I said, there's so much struggle for a lot of people that when they come to that realization, maybe they do want to be really seen. Like
Mm.
maybe they do want that. Maybe they do want some attention about that. No one is really harmed by that. If anything, I don't know. I feel very deeply uncomfortable with the idea of everybody staring at me and like being seen that closely by people. But when I told you that I
Mm.
was non-binary, you like were excited for me, and that was the first
Mm.
time that I had that. I felt very excited and very seen by it in a
Mm.
way that I hadn't before. So I can understand why somebody would want attention for
Mm.
that.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. And I think people misunderstand, if there's like an attention seeking thing, that there's some
Mm,
sort of negative aspect rather than this like explosion of energy after having figured it
yeah.
out and, toiled because it's like no
Hmm.
shortage of a lot of work, and then wanting to share that with others. I love what you say about connection. It's so true that it's really an invitation to somebody's internal world,
Hmm.
that has been cloistered away, for a good reason. Maybe it's
Hmm.
to figure it out or for safety or whatever. And so once those gates open, people, but they're not looking for, or most people are not looking for a rubber stamp. It's not that kind of
No.
attention seeking. It's more of an expression, finally, probably a
Hmm.
bit bottled up. And so that's where the energy is coming from.
Yeah.
Of course, everyone's different. And, there could be some aspect of people needing affirmation. There's nothing wrong with that either.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's sad that people can't see this as something positive, and
Hmm.
instead it's very, rather dismissive of what
Yeah.
people are sharing. We've largely in our society only talked about men and women, boys and girls. That's that's it in people's minds, and so
Yeah.
um, they tend to be a bit surprised when, like other things, gender is also a spectrum. um,
Mm.
and so I don't know if you have any other kind of thoughts on that matter in terms of why people think it's made up.
I think that it's like a huge, well, how existential can I get? Let me, well, I'll try
As
and I'll try and dampen it down. I think it's like a massive like self-denial when people deny
mm,
the existence of non-binary people. I
mm,
think that people see gender as this sort of rigid box to put myself in, to
mm,
contain myself. And to contain yourself is
mm,
like a self-denial, in my opinion.
mm,
It's reducing yourself down to a list of things that are acceptable.
mm,
And so when people look at it as made up, I think that they're missing huge parts of themselves too.
mm,
I read about a study where participants watched videos of people they don't know putting their hands in ice water. The researchers found that the participants' own hands had a noticeable drop in temperature, like just from watching these videos. Along with a few things, I think that this really shows innate empathy and compassion of humans and
sure.
how we are built to connect and to see each other. That's how we're
Hmm.
designed. And so when you deny my existence as a non-binary person, you are denying so much of yourself too.
Mm,
And when you see me as a non-binary person, you also open up all these possibilities for yourself too.
mm,
And that's how I view it. And I think that we are really scared of that.
mm,
And we really can learn most about this from Indigenous groups, in my opinion, from around the world. There are so many communities around the world that recognize not just a third gender, but a fourth gender and a fifth gender. And maybe they don't look at gender at all in the way that we
mm,
do. There are so many examples of the expansiveness of humans and the idea that we can just reduce ourselves down to two lists
mm.
is silly, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not real. And being non binary is more real than being within the binary, for me, at least.
Mm,
I think we can
hmm.
learn a lot from people who are not restricted by Western uh, views of gender.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Such a good point too, and it points to non-binary folks having existed, or
Mm,
let's not even, like, sometimes non-binary is a modern term for something that has existed for so long in many
right.
different forms, and that it's already been recognized in different times around the world,
Hmm.
and that it is like an expansive version. And I like what you said too about if someone is very upset by this or dismissive or discounting, there that might shed some light on what are aspects within themselves that they're discounting or
Hmm.
dismissing, right? So it's a kind of inward reflection of their own
For sure.
experience, but of course it also impacts the non-binary person, right? Like these have
Sure.
real implications too. So
Hmm.
but that, given how we're connected we are, that anything but wanting to know more is something going on for the other person. So yeah,
Hmm. And I do get that it can be confusing in a
sure.
world where we have these binaries. I can completely understand why non-binary identity as a whole can be really confusing for people. But I think if you can understand that there are things outside of your own experience. You don't
Mhm.
actually have to understand what it is. You can just understand that it exists.
Mhm. Yeah. And also respect what that person is stating, what their needs are, or
Hmm.
what they go by, any number of things. So,
Hmm.
and actually that leads me into another question I have when it comes
Mm.
to non-binary identities. A big factor, at least for some folks, is, okay, what do I do about it? And some
Yeah.
aspect of the everyday is our pronouns, right? And
Mm.
so I'm curious to hear from you about pronouns, whether, both the how they help us, especially how we interact with one another, but also how they can sometimes create limits as well. So
Mm.
just curious your thoughts on those.
I really find the conversation about pronouns like exciting, but also exhausting and annoying.
Mm,
So I think that often non-binary identities are reduced down to pronouns, and
yeah.
that's all people think
Mm,
of is androgyny and pronouns, and that's
mm,
what a non-binary person is. And well, firstly, I should say that using they them pronouns isn't something that is just a non-binary experience. So, or
right.
you can be non-binary and not use they them pronouns at all. For
Mhm.
example, I was pretty sure I was non-binary 2 years before I started using they them pronouns. And so in those 2 years, I was using exclusively she and her, and I was still non-binary in those moments. In fact, I've been non-binary my whole life. I just didn't know
Right.
it. And I was still using she and her pronouns. And so there might be non-binary people and you don't even know because they haven't expressed that they are
Yep.
non-binary and they haven't told you that they have different pronouns. So you might
Right.
know some non-binary people. The second part of that, I would say, is that to use they them pronouns doesn't mean that you are non-binary either. There are people who use they them
Mm,
pronouns for actually like a whole load of reasons. There's some people that use
right.
it just because they don't like being restricted by the gender, by the way that we normalize different acts within gender, that sort of list of what
Right.
is right for certain genders. Some people just want to use they them pronouns to kind of separate themselves from that. I know
Mm,
somebody who uses both he, him, and they, them pronouns,
mhm,
not because he's non-binary, but because he has a kid and he wants that child to
mm,
learn about they, them pronouns, and so
mm,
uses them to normalize it in their house.
right.
And they are not non-binary, but
Right.
they just use it because it's sort of, yeah, making it comfortable for their kid. And
Mm,
I love that. I think that's a really great use of those pronouns, to
that's
be
so
honest with
sweet.
you.
Yeah.
Isn't it so
Yeah. Yeah.
nice? And so pronouns are not restricted to, or they them pronouns, sorry, are not restricted to non-binary people.
Mm,
Also, we all have pronouns, so it's not like this new thing that's happened. I think that's another thing. People are complaining about us going crazy and wanting to use pronouns. You've never gone through a day in your life without
yeah.
using at least one pronoun, unless you have been entirely silent and just sitting in a box with
Right.
your eyes closed. Then
Okay.
I
So
will concede that you maybe have.
if you've been on a silent retreat, maybe not. But other than that,
Sure, if you're going
99.99% of
about
the
your day to
population.
day, yes. There are pronouns are things that we have always used. You cannot go through your life without using them. So it's not a sort of crazy thing that non-binary
Mm.
people have invented. Also, there is this idea that there is the grammar. We must adhere to grammar,
Ah,
and
yes,
we
yes.
must. There's so many tangents I could go on with this. The first is
Mm,
it's very Anglocentric. There are
mm,
so many languages that use pronouns in a different way or use grammar in a different way. Humanity is so much bigger than the language that we've invented.
for
Um,
sure.
but not only that, we do use the singular they them all the time. Like we use
Oh
it
my
all the
gosh.
time.
So true.
Someone's parked their car outside my house. I hope they move it soon because I need to go to work. Is a
Right.
completely normal sentence. And uses a
Yeah.
singular they them.
For
It just
one
means we
person.
don't know.
Yeah.
Right. We just don't know what their gender
We
is.
don't
That's all that
we don't
means.
expect a group of 3 people to come out and move the car.
And how else would we say it? Like he or she has parked his or her car outside my house. I hope he or she comes back to move it. It's crazy. We don't speak like that.
It is
Mm.
proper grammar. It's also, returning back to how we used to say things
Hmm.
in kind of Shakespearean time. Obviously, not only relying on Shakespeare to make this
Thank
possible,
God.
but but certainly it's not a new thing,
No,
essentially.
it's not. And
Yeah.
and even if it were, does it
Mm,
honestly matter? Really? Does it matter? I just don't think it does. If you're going to be making people feel seen and understood,
yeah.
maybe if they don't feel like that with the current grammar scheme that we have,
Mhm.
maybe it might be time to update that to reflect the experiences that everybody has, not just the experiences of a sort of accepted way of speaking.
Mm, mhm. Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
also grammatically correct. So,
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And so important to kind of parse out all of these different components, and I appreciate what you said at the beginning too of this question is just of course we talk about this topic within the context of somebody being non-binary, but that's not it's not the only thing, and
no.
it's one part of a larger puzzle for somebody to be fully accepted and seen for who they are. So, but still
Mm.
important to touch on it because it does come up,
Of
and
course.
demystifying some of these things. And what about for your own pronouns?
I use both she, her, and they, them pronouns. That's really reflective of that fluidity. I
Mm.
don't mind which, so obviously, it would be the best if on the moments that I'm feeling like a woman, people use she and
Mm,
her, and on the moments where I'm not, people would use they and them. That would be my ideal.
right.
Sometimes I don't necessarily know what
Mm,
where I'm where I am until somebody uses a specific pronoun
mm,
for me. So I have a lot of leniency and like I'm not, it's okay for me. It
mm,
doesn't bother me. It doesn't upset me. It doesn't hurt me in any way. And if it did, then there would be things that I could do to
right.
say, like, hey, these are the pronouns I'm using right now. So but for me, I don't mind. When I first told people that I was using they, them pronouns,
Yeah.
I was a lot more I talked it down a lot more than I realized I
Mm,
felt. So when I
mm,
first introduced it to people, I would say things like, I'm using she, her, and they, them pronouns, but she, her's fine. And I would sort of dismiss that
right.
part of me
Huh.
because I think I was very worried about being a burden. And that's another part, is that people are worried that
Mm,
trans and non-binary people are going to explode if you get it wrong. And actually, I wanted to create as little drama as possible around
mm,
this. So I haven't told very many people, and the people that I have told, I led with that entirely. That
right.
you can carry on using she, her, so nothing changes for them. It's all about how they're feeling and how they perceive it. And that's how I went through it. And then, I have a huge privilege in that I work for Trans Focus. So there's a lot of understanding around this. So
I would
when
hope.
I
I would
told,
hope.
yeah, this is where I'm like, hot take. Actually, trans focus are terrible about pronouns. Trans focus
Exactly.
as a
What?
whole misgender me repeatedly.
Headlines.
So when I told you, you switched to they, them immediately. And
Mm.
I literally felt like I was on fire. I
Oh,
was so excited and I was so happy. And it was the first time
huh.
that I had received that. And so
Mm,
it felt like being seen for the first time ever. Even though I had told other people before, it was the first time that it had been an immediate switch. You are the only people, you and Nico, our other
mm,
colleague Nico, are the only people that refer to me in that way. And it's not that it's a thing that I mind exactly, but it's a
right.
noticeable thing to me
Right.
that I
Yes.
can feel so seen. And it was really exciting, and it was such an amazing experience to have that for the first time. What I
Mm,
will say is that the other day, Nico referred to me as she, her in
mm,
a meeting, and I had the exact same feeling, which is so bizarre to me because I
mm,
always have that. So
mhm,
I think it's just in the context of these people that see me, it was a really noticeable moment for me that I
huh.
felt electric and excited about hearing she, her pronouns, which I've never had in my life because I'm always referred to in that way.
Wow. Is that because, I mean, I'm sure there's many reasons, but is it because there's the use of they them that allows for the she to have a different
I think
experience
so.
of the she?
I think so. Yeah, because I know that
Oh,
you're not exclusively seeing me in that way.
right.
Does
Yeah.
that make sense? In
Absolutely.
with Nico and you, I'm not
Yeah.
exclusively being seen as she, her. I know that you use they, them pronouns because you predominantly do use they, them pronouns with me.
Mm,
That on hearing she, her, it was like another, like buzz
Hmm.
of like, oh, I'm really being seen. Even though I don't think that was actually intentional. I think that he just said it. I think that he
I
just said it.
mean,
So
who's to say? Let's
right,
get him on
we'll
phone
ask.
call. Just kidding.
Yeah.
But I mean, I wonder because the way that you describe your gender fluidity, there is a noticing that takes place, and you're doing
Mhm.
that internally, but people could be feeling that externally as well, like intuiting.
Maybe.
I don't want to give too much onto Nico that maybe is not there
Oh,
for
he.
him, but we are, like you said, connected. So there is transfer of information, even if words aren't exchanged.
Mhm.
So if people could tap into more of that,
Mhm.
perhaps they could know, when to
Maybe.
say she, or maybe just allow it to happen organically. And it's like, oh, she popped out. Oh, they
Mhm.
popped out, just like, be there's an attuning to,
Mhm.
that has to happen, or not has to happen, but is a part of the
Yeah,
process.
yeah.
So, yeah.
It was
Mm,
such a it was a really weird experience because well,
mm,
I noticed my pronouns 100% of the time. I'm never not noticing
mm,
what pronouns somebody's using,
right.
and it doesn't. It's not in a negative way. I'm just aware of it all
Yeah.
the time, and so I don't know. I just wasn't expecting that pronoun to be used from this person individually. I just wasn't
Hmm.
expecting it, and it was a really lovely moment of feeling like I'd been seen, which is odd because yeah, somebody had referred to me as she like half an hour prior, but
Mm,
just because that was an assumption, whereas it doesn't feel like an assumption when people are
mm,
using your pronouns consciously, you know?
yeah. 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 The intentionality is key,
Yeah.
because in general society, we are quite unaware. We
Hmm.
just, people may not even realize what they're doing, of like
Hmm.
looking at somebody, categorizing them as feminine or masculine, maybe
Hmm.
androgynous, and then attributing pronouns, like that
Hmm.
two-step unconscious kind of assumption, versus knowing somebody's pronoun and then applying them accordingly. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a really great
Dang.
feeling to feel
Huh.
seen, and I wish everybody could experience that. But I do
Yeah.
feel that here
Yeah.
for sure.
And I'm so glad you described it too, because I think for folks for whom they've maybe always or mostly had their proper pronouns used, that may not realize how hard it is to get misgendered, and
Mm.
or not intentionally use of pronouns towards them. And so this, when you do get that, it's a
Hmm.
quite a very exciting experience. It could be the basis of, like, a deeper relationship,
Hmm.
no matter the context. It could be workplace,
Hmm.
friendship, romantic, and what otherwise. Super important. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's just provided a lot of really rich insight, in terms of your story, but then also, I'm sure, for others as well, to just be a lot more aware, not necessarily just about pronouns, but just in general. Like, when are we kind of jumping to conclusions rather
Hmm.
than providing space for somebody to show up for who they actually are,
For sure.
and to be interested in that, and providing a safe place for somebody to surface that. So,
Hmm.
yeah. um so I'm just thinking of a few other kind of final questions, just to wrap things up here. But I guess the one thing, going forward, just thinking about, non-binary awareness in general, and there's steps being taken to increase that
Mm.
awareness. But I'm just wondering, we're 2025 now, and kind of looking ahead, you know, what else is needed? Of course, there's so much, so it's kind of an unfair
Where do I
question. You're
start?
like,
Yeah.
the list is unfurled. Um, but yeah, to some degree right now, at least in the way that I see it, it's somewhat performative.
Mm.
Um, and I think part of it is because I think people are afraid of making mistakes. This feels like, for some folks, this is new. And so,
Mhm.
I do this when something is new. I revert to the most basic, simplest thing, so that I'll be guaranteed that I won't be wrong, or, less wrong. And so, yeah, how do we shift out of that performativity and just looking ahead to, kind of that brighter future that many of us are working towards? What are your thoughts on that?
I think maybe this isn't a good answer, but I think that it probably starts with ourselves. And it goes going back to that study that I mentioned, the idea that you're watching a group of people plunging their hands into ice water and
Hmm.
that these participants' own hands lowered just by watching that really speaks to the connection and the empathy that is embedded in humans'
Mm-hmm.
DNA. And it's the reason that we like listening to a podcast of two friends laughing, even though we don't
Mm.
know the joke and we don't know those people. It's
Yeah.
because connection is just a part of our lives. And so if we can connect with ourselves and understand the way that our society has built gender and
Mm.
what messaging we've received that has taught us about who we are, and maybe that
Mm.
fits and maybe it doesn't fit, and maybe we can undo the bits that don't fit and we can pick the bits that do fit and actually get
Mm.
to know ourselves, really get to know ourselves. I don't think that we make room for knowing who we are in
Mm.
our society. So if you can start there, I think you will find it a lot easier then to understand and connect with non-binary people and trans people more widely.
Hmm.
Does that
Yeah.
answer that question?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And perhaps for some in a surprising twist, because you're right that many times when they're, I talk about trans and non binary folks as this mystical other, right? Some people think we're kind of this mysterious, like, whoa, what's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so there can be a lot of focus, like, tell me
Mm-hmm.
everything so I can fully absorb and
Mm-hmm.
understand. And I mean, I understand that
Yeah, of course.
impulse. It's not coming from a bad place at all. In fact, that there is an aspect of a bid for connection there too.
Mm-hmm.
However, you're right that also a part of the equation is the connection to oneself,
Mm-hmm.
and depending on how that's going, we may or may not be able to accept others to
Mm-hmm.
or to have that understanding, because you're right, everybody has some aspects that align with societal expectations, and then there are other aspects not related to gender necessarily
Mm-hmm.
that don't align, and
Right.
we kind of cleave off parts of ourselves to fit these narrow molds and do great damage to
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. And we all deserve to be full human
Mm-hmm.
beings. That includes, trans and non-binary folks. It includes cisgender folks, and the degree to which one is connected to oneself makes it easier to connect with others,
For sure.
including non-binary folks, in a way that don't have to know everything to accept everything,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I think
So
that's another big answer to that, though, is to understand that you don't actually need to know anything at all other than what I've told you about myself. That's
yeah.
all it really takes. And I think we can all benefit from connecting with ourselves. And maybe
Hmm.
that would make us more free to accept others for who they say they are and not who you
Yeah.
think they should be.
Yes, absolutely. And with that, I think that's a powerful place to end this. I'm sure we could keep going because there's so much more than this, but I think it's a really important place to have that greater understanding. And thank you so much again for sharing your story. I mean, it takes a lot of vulnerability to open up in the way that you have, and it's a very powerful model, hopefully, to others to share, of course, when they feel safe and ready to do so. But the your presence with yourself is very inspiring. I've heard what you shared, and I found that very profound. Especially people have an easier time, perhaps, when things are one way, but when there's multiplicity, when there's no model for it, I think there's a lot of difficulty there. And
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you're able to really stay present with yourself, to understand yourself, is very powerful. So thank you for sharing
Thanks.
that.
Thanks, Kai.
And yeah, well, I've really enjoyed this conversation with you. Also, before we go, I want to mention that in the show notes, we're going to put a link to a resource on non binary people and identities. And basically, we'll give you a little bit more information about terms and concepts. So, of course, we talked about gender fluidity here today, but there's other identities, agender, genderqueer, underneath this bigger umbrella of non binary identities. We'll talk about everyday interactions and how to be inclusive and supportive of non binary folks. And so, hopefully, just equip you with the tools necessary to be a great ally of non-binary folks. So definitely check it out, and super interested, and hopefully it's really helpful to you. Thank you so much again, and we'll close it out here for now. So goodbye.
See you later.